I'm here today to talk a little bit about the Canadian context, and it's very encouraging to see what is going here in Finland and also in the rest of Europe. And I think we are somewhat a little bit behind in the development in Canada, but I think we have a probably even greater need for the things we're talking about here today, and I'll try to provide some context into that. And I just kind of I usually show this slide in Finland, in Canada, just to show the opportunity. And if you look at the numbers here, in terms of in British Columbia, that's where I'm from, and my colleague Tim, who's over here, who'll be talking a little bit later. So we're both from Vancouver in British Columbia, and if you look at the amount of area and timber that is produced out of that, that really should give you an idea of the opportunity, right? So we have about 3 times the amount of forest, but we're harvesting less than is being harvested here. So, and one of the reasons I think is because we are not using as much of the new information communication photonic opportunities that are being used in the European context. To provide even more context, when we're talking about forests and forestry in eastern Canada, over here it's more cut-to-length operations. We're more in the boreal forest, so very similar to what is going on here. But the further west we move, the more we're moving into tree-length operations. And so I think in the Canadian context, in the worldwide context, probably we are the best at tree-length harvesting. But when you look at the different machine types that are being used, they're not very conducive to collecting a lot of information. A lot of the information you're getting from using cut-to-length technologies, where you have all the computers and sensors on board. With tree-length equipment, we don't even know how many stems per hectare we're harvesting in a day. So that's a big challenge that we're facing. So that's the challenge. The opportunity is this is harvest residues in Finland, and these are harvest residues in Canada. And it's not a joke. I'm serious. So this is what's currently being burned on site after harvesting operation. Of course, it is a little bit exaggerated, but at the same time it's not. Depending on where you are and the assortment that's being harvested, that is really a scenario of biomass being burned. And wherever there is no economic use, which is really our biggest challenge, that a lot of these areas are so remote that the saw log being taken out from the forest is really the only product that's coming out. And since I moved to Canada, I was hired back then to look after the bioenergy, the feedstock program. More of the material is using, particularly to the pellet industry. But we need to improve the economics to remove some of that biomass and find a better use for it. But at the same time, it's such a big opportunity because essentially there is saw logs in there, but we don't necessarily have a customer for them being used. But at the same time, it's not all bad. I think a lot of good developments have happened over the last 10, 15 years. The pulp and paper industry is now mostly powered by bioenergy. Especially the pellets, I think, are a really big success stories. We're exporting, I think, about 2 million tons of pellets from BC alone, mostly to Europe, mostly to the UK and the Netherlands. And I think there's potential for even more. They're even one of the biggest pellet producers is building another plant in Edmonton. So and then they're railing the pellets over to British Columbia and putting them on big boats. And I think especially as the Asian markets are developing more and there's more demands for pellets in that sector, there's bigger opportunities to again use some of this material further in pellets. We have standalone power. Again, this is one of the downsides, I think, whereas here most of the material is used in CHP facilities. We're still on electricity only, which of course doesn't necessarily improve the efficiency. Small scale applications are becoming more prevalent as well. We're looking at bigger truck configurations. Unfortunately, we don't have a neighbor that's pushing the boundaries as much as that is happening here. So I was presenting 2 weeks ago in Sweden at a conference, and they were complaining that they went to 72 or 73, and then the Finns went to 76, and now they're at 90, and the Finns are going to 96. So I think that's a good competition, improving the economics on trucking, and don't quote me on those numbers, but we also have the tallest wooden building right now in, I think it's in the world, but the Norwegians are building a taller wooden building, and the ones we have is on UBC, made out of CLT. And actually we are starting at UBC also a bioeconomy undergraduate degree. So a lot of these things have really become mainstream and have changed the way we operate. So again, we're looking at the fiber supply chain. We have lots of opportunity. There's lots of fiber when we compare the situation to, especially to here, large trees, and that's really been the backbone of Canadian forestry. We've always been able to rely on big trees, fairly close to mills, and that's where a lot of the efficiency has been coming from, and that's how we've competed on the world markets. Very large operations, big machines, and focus on a very small number of commodity products, 2x4s, etc., that go to very specific markets, mostly in the US, which has somewhat been challenging now with the recent administration that we have in the States. At the same time, there's big challenges around that. So long transportation distances, a very complicated tenure system. If you remember at the beginning, the slides doing the comparison, whereas here most of the forest is in private ownership, most of our forest in Canada is publicly owned, which puts a whole lot of more pressure on preserving the resource and administrating how the resource is being used. Public perception is very different. I think Canadians think of the forest, especially in urban areas around Vancouver, forest is something that needs to be preserved, and people really don't like when they see trees being cut down. I think it's completely different whenever you see an advertisement for forestry here in Nordic countries. It's actually trees being cut down. So it's a very, very different perception of forestry. And then climate change is my lead into the next few slides, which has really been very challenging for us in British Columbia. So this is a picture of the mountain pine beetle, and this underlines the need for more of these new communication information technologies, because we need to get a much better understanding of what we have on the land base, where change is happening, and how we manage that. So this picture is from kind of the height of the mountain pine beetle outbreak in 20, I think it was at the end of 2010. This is not taken in the fall, and you have nice fall colors. These are all dead trees, what you see in the red. So these are trees that were affected by mountain pine beetle. And what happened here, and I just have a quick time, so this is in 1999, and you can see here how the mountain pine beetle has increased in British Columbia. We're now in 2005, 2006, 2007, and here what you can see is a major shift, because now the mountain pine beetle has crossed over the Rockies and is now basically able to spread east across the whole country, and we're expecting that to happen over the next few years. So still continuing, we're now in 2015, 18 million hectares affected, 60% mortality of mature pines is dead, which is really an unprecedented outbreak. And now we have to deal with the consequences. One of the advantages that shelf life, so how long the material can be used, is fairly long with mountain pine beetle. But we are really having that urgency to use as much of that material as we can. Now, as all of that material is on the ground, we're seeing more summers, most likely compared to due to climate change. And now this is a picture, two pictures I took from the computer, 28th of August 2018. This is the amount of fires. I think on that day there was 500 fires burning in British Columbia. I think the last 2 years we burned about 2.5 million hectares. So this is again an opportunity where we need detection, where we need to identify areas where we have very high mortality of pine trees, so that we can much better manage risks and values on the landscape, because we're really in the blind right now when it comes to that. So as I said, 2017, 2018, both record fire seasons that we've, biggest fire seasons we've ever seen, with 2.5 million hectares burned. And Tim later on has a bit more detail on what happened. But what this means for the industry, and that's the big challenge, is that there's going to be a big drop. But this is one timber supply area in Williams Lake in the interior of British Columbia, but you can see that the cut here is expected to go from 3.5 million cubic meters per year down to somewhere 1.3. And then you can see here this has been even made worse by the recent fire season. So big challenges that we have to deal with. And not only that, there's other beetles. Now we have to deal with the spruce beetle in the areas where the pine wasn't killed. Now the spruce beetle is there. We have spruce budworm more in the eastern part of Canada. We have to deal with caribou management, that the federal government has put in some regulation that will have a large effect on the area that will be available for timber supply. We have First Nations challenges in regards that they're getting ownership of the land, and they manage their land for different values. We're seeing much more community forests, again, that don't necessarily manage just for timber supply, but other recreational values around communities. And we need tools that allow for better planning, so that we can have a better idea of what's out there and what's the best use of it. And again, if we compare the situation to here, where you have cell coverage across the country, you can see here we have seen some improvements, but we still have a lot of the areas. If you look at British Columbia, Alberta, it's fairly easy because it's flat. If we look at British Columbia, we see an improvement, but especially in the forest areas, we don't have cell phone coverage, which then doesn't necessarily allow us for having the kind of data transfer, data communication, machine-to-machine communication that we're seeing in forestry here, especially in Nordic countries. So I think it was about two and a half years ago, FP Innovations really started to look at what are the opportunities in this space around Forestry 4.0, building on the Industry 4.0 principle, and developed we actually started with developing a small video, and you can Google that video, and I'm sure you'll find it. But I was at a conference two years ago, and there was a Finnish speaker speaking about Forestry 4.0, and he said, my colleagues in Canada made a very good video about Forestry 4.0. And he actually showed the entire video, and I was really happy. I said, okay, well, we really have something to offer, but then when the video was over, he said, well, actually in Finland we're doing all of that already. So it was somewhat sobering, but I think it was a good reflection of kind of where we are at and where we want to go in the Canadian context. But we have a lot of different challenges and, of course, different scales to deal with than what is going on here. So I'll just go through some examples where on the different areas that we're working in real environment is really getting a better understanding of the forest and what is around us. LiDAR acquisition, for example, is we don't have LiDAR coverage across the landscape, which is a very challenging issue when you're trying to do forest management planning, and we're mostly in the dark with that. We're seeing some companies investing on tree farm licenses, which are essentially the companies have planning security. On all the private land has LiDAR coverage, which is very interesting. So the challenge really remains the public. And we don't necessarily, on public lands where we don't have LiDAR, where we actually need it the most. Data generation, data harmonization, as I said, on cut to length equipment, you have all the sensors to collect data. On tree length equipment, we don't have that. So we're actually right now developing sensors to do just stem counting on a feller buncher. That's the machine that just grabs the tree and lays it down. But there's no volume calculations or anything associated with that. So we have rough ideas of what we're harvesting, but not a very good and detailed ideas. And then compliance monitoring, that is part of the Forest Act in Canada, in making sure that the stand is regenerated after harvesting. So on the LiDAR, we actually working at FP Innovations, we put together a business case, and you can see, the LiDAR, the benefits would be huge if we take other values, oil, gas, water management, earthquake management into consideration. It's a payback of 1 to 4 years, but it's making that initial investment that's really the challenge in getting that LiDAR information, and something we've been pushing very hard, and I think we're finally getting some traction in order to improve decision making on the land base. On the wood flow side, as I said, we're working a lot with machine manufacturers, developing sensors for tree length equipment. We are seeing, especially on steep slopes, more winch assist harvesting system, which are based on the cut to length system. So there's some improvements there. And starting to overlay satellite data or other remote sensing data to improve decision making on the land base. This is just a few slides on the type of looking at the residues that are left after harvesting, looking at the harvest residue piles. But if here the big challenge that we're facing is we're getting a good idea of how big the piles are, but we don't know necessarily yet what's inside the pile. So that's something that we're still working on, because that's an area where we have a lot of potential. We've developed an app at FP Innovations to look at, so you can go out in the forest, look at a stand, and see what the biomass availability is in that particular stand. So that's one of the first kind of app developments that we can see where we need more of that in order to become more mainstream. On the Internet of Forest, as I said, the big challenge here, and Tim will talk a little bit more about that in his presentation, communication. Not only between the machines and the mill, but especially also machine to machine, which is a big challenge in managing, of course, any supply chain. We are seeing a major shift on mechanizing harvesting on steep slopes. It's a big challenge. A lot of that is still hand-felled. We're seeing more winch assist machine systems that are prevalent in Central Europe. They're coming in, and of course with those it's easy to work and get better data about what we're doing. Wildfires, we are paying, and this is something I've been working on for 6 years that I'm in Canada, and I'm counting on Timo to make something happen there. There's, for a fire smart treatment, this is a treatment to reduce fuel loads around the community. Communities are paid between 10,000, okay, let's say $5,000 to $15,000 per hectare. So in my mind, and having the experience being here in Finland for 11 years, there has to be opportunities to make that cheaper. And I think that's, again, a very big opportunity with new equipment, with new sensors, with anything that can make these operations more efficient, and understanding us where we need to do those treatments. I think that's really the challenge, to make better decisions about where we go on the land base and treat areas that have a very high fuel load. That is going to make a very big difference moving forward. We have lots of interest in autonomous and teleoperated machines. Down here in Canadian forest now, with we're running out of fiber, we have cycle times of up to 10 hours sometimes in trucking, and we have a huge shortage of truck operators. So again, that's an opportunity where we see big efficiency gains in the next 5 to 10 years. And then we've been working a lot on integrating biomass harvesting into traditional harvesting. And again, after 6 years now, we're starting to see some traction and more interest into that. On the data analytics side, so we are seeing very positive signs. The government has just approved last year the digital technology supercluster, which basically makes 400 million available, 200 coming from government, 200 million coming from industry to support the digitalization. Again, we've heard that earlier. It's not a sectoral support, but it's broad support across the landscape where you're supposed to form teams. Both FP Innovations, UBC, and a couple of industry members, we just got a project approved that is looking at sensor development and a benchmarking tool to better understand where we're at and be able to compare and have an analytics platform to support some of the efficiency gains that we know that are already existing in other jurisdictions. We have some specific targets. I'm running out of time, so I won't go into that. But just maybe on the BC sites, we don't even have all trucks equipped with GPS. So that's a fairly easy milestone we need to achieve. Harvest blocks transmitting real-time data is something that we're looking at. Waste surveys. So after every harvesting, we have to survey waste. And a lot of that could be done, as we heard earlier this morning, by drones. So that's another area we're currently working on. And reducing the need to go out in the forest. Again, if we have these huge forest areas, we don't have very good forest management plans. So there's still a lot of field work. The more we can reduce the amount of field work that's needed to get that information, the more efficiency the operations will get. So connectivity is one of the major challenges. We need better forest information to improve decision making, and I think we have, and when we're seeing all the tools that are available, we're working on the adoption of those. We have a much higher variability across the landscape. I think here we have three main tree species. We're dealing with up to 10, 15 tree species sometimes. We need better strategies like the bioeconomy. We just published a bioeconomy, or the federal government published a bioeconomy strategy either earlier this year or late last year. And labor shortage is a big challenge that we need to address. And again, I think that's where we're working on some of with on some of the same tools and attracting other skill sets from the IT industry, for example, into forestry. Major investments are coming. We are partly here to learn from what's going on in Nordic countries and really try to build collaborations and teams that can solve some of these challenges together. So I think that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominik, about an excellent presentations on Canada situations. So in Finland we have during the last years taken, I think, huge steps in opening data. We have excellent land survey data available. We have meteorological data, and now we have opened really excellent forest inventory data for companies for utilizing that and for technology companies to create new services based on that. In Canada, is there a serious discussion about doing something similar? Because I think that data is the missing key, and in Finland we have used that whenever we go doing something in the forest or planning something, we need a map, and that map has to include the information on what is there in the forest.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and you're absolutely right. Data and good LiDAR data or mapping information, it's what's missing. I think the thinking is exactly in the same direction, that it should be open to everybody once it is acquired. And again, we're talking about private land, so public land. So if the government flies with LiDAR, it should be available to everybody. Our challenge is to find somebody to make that initial investment in actually getting the data. And I think there is a willingness for that data to be open. The government is actually going right now, the provincial government is going out to industry, reaching out and trying to buy back some of the areas that have been flown by the industry. And there's no discussion even. Whenever industry has planning security on the land base, and what I mean with that is that the way tenure works is that you have the right to cut in a certain volume, but that volume is not associated with a given area. So that means you could be harvesting, you could be flying your LiDAR in a given area, and then next time around you're not harvesting in the same area because you're somewhere else. Wherever industry has planning security, we have good data, but it's wherever when we're on the public land base, which is 70%, that's where the big challenge is. And I think we're thinking exactly in the same direction. It's really getting to that first investment and making it happen.
I'm Anna Rakemaa from Finnish Forestry Center, Suomen Metsäkeskus. It more a comment maybe. You were saying that government has put an initiative for digitalization in the whole society, I think. And our recent government still sitting until next fall, next spring. They also put a digitalization plan and also financing plan for this their season, and it also meant that we got a specific amount of money and program for digitalization in forestry and forestry-based industry. And with this, that we got this money from the government, and we actually already had a plan what we wanted to do, and then this sort of came like a gift afterwards, that this could be maybe the way that we could finance a program that was very much based on a public and private partnership. And it was a good way to develop certain areas of the digitalization in forestry. So I don't know if that's a tool that you could maybe get into this program that it's now building up in your country.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, and you know, we had a first meeting, and to your point, we had a first meeting with the main industry partners that are behind that, because the government funding only comes with co-financing, your match funding from industry. And the comment actually was that industry said, we would have funded that by ourselves. it's nice to get that extra government money, but I think they've realized that their digitalization is such a big gain for their operations. They're having that planning security, and they would have done it anyway. But it's nice to get some extra, a half from the government to move that forward.
Are you cooperating with the photonics in Canada?
Yes, so I think coming to the Forestry 4.0 initiative, I think we've laid out kind of the major research needs that the forest industry has, and we've identified partners that can answer some of these questions. And because I think we've come to the realization at FP Innovations that we can't do that by ourselves, and we need to reach out to the proper partners, and the photonics partners are definitely included in that relationship, because I think we've also realized, as we heard this morning, that they're essential to everything we do, because we need to see better of what's out there and use that information to improve our decision making.